everybody, to Integrate Yourself. We are your hosts, Allison Pillow and Maya Gottlieb. Today we're here with Kyle Mamounis. You've got all kinds of credentials, Kyle. He pursued a bachelor's in biology at Rowan University and a PhD in nutritional science at Rutgers University, and he studied nutrition and health there, as well as his 2017 dissertation was entitled The Metabolic Effects of Linolenic Acid versus Saturated Fat in Male Mice, Female Mice, and Offspring Exposed Maternally. He looked at differences in hypothalamic inflammation, obesity, and metabolic syndrome from high-fat diets of varying fatty acid profiles. He has since taken a biochemistry postdoctoral research position at Burnett School of Biomedical Science at the University of Central Florida, and occasionally argues with people on the RapeEatForum.com. His future plans include online courses of alternative perspectives and biomedical science, publishing articles on philosophy and economics using a biological perspective, and a sprawling book on the problems within the current scientific research establishment. We need that one so bad. Thank you, Kyle, for coming on, and we appreciate you so much. I first saw Kyle at the Ancestral Health Symposium, and where he's talking about sugar, the debate between whether sugar causes insulin resistance or not. And that was a super interesting presentation. Although today we were going to talk about estrogen, and he's done a lot of research on estrogen and estrogen receptors, and as well the misconceptions about estrogen, and especially in the medical community. So we're going to talk about that today. Thanks, Kyle, for coming on. If you could just share a little bit more about you and what you're researching at this moment.
So I got into studying nutrition from experimenting on myself, and I did like vegetarian, veganism, raw veganism. Have you ever heard of Agenus Vonderplanitz?
No, what is that?
He died actually a couple of years ago.
Oh, wait. Did he have like a YouTube channel or something that he did a lot of raw stuff?
Yeah. I never actually looked at his YouTube channel, but I had his book. And he had something called the Primal Diet. And then Mark Sisson just like took that term from him. He wasn't that popular. But yeah, that's when I started like eating like raw, like unpasteurized milk and stuff like that. And then I tried like a paleo diet where I was just eating raw meat.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff.
I tried that one time, but I think I was open to it more than most, because if you come from a European background, you know what tartare is, like meat tartare. But go ahead. I mean, I know that's kind of hard to do a raw meat diet.
Yeah, I did that for like years.
How many years did you do that actually? Like,
it was from like 2008 to 2011.
Oh wow, that's a long time.
Like I entered my PhD program at Rutgers with like those glass lot containers, like glass with the plastic tops.
Oh yeah,
those of like raw meat, and I would like eat them during class. It's always a conversation starter.
I bet.
Because people know what raw meat looks like.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
There's no fooling them. It's like, oh yeah, this is just regular cooked meat. They're like, no, that's raw meat. I see it. And yeah, I was doing that, and that's actually where I met Danny Roddy. Was the first Ancestral Health Symposium was at UCLA, I think, and I stayed with somebody, this older guy, Lex Rooker, who it was active on this raw paleo forum where people talked about eating like a raw meat based diet. And he was super nice. And I told him I wanted to go, and I was like, oh, I don't know if and he's like, well, you can stay with me, if that helps. And it did. And then he was friends with Danny, because Danny's also from California and had also tried those kinds of diets. So I met Danny Roddy, and didn't know anything about Ray Peat. I think maybe I saw somebody post something he said, and I just thought it was ridiculous on one of these paleo forums. And then I started my PhD program so this was like August of 2011. I'm eating raw meat all the time. I just met Danny Roddy, didn't know anything about repeat, still believed that like sugar causes insulin resistance or whatever. And then started my PhD program. And pretty quickly, just from the classes I was taking, the like simplistic stories started to break down. So, and then I started reading this repeat stuff. And at first I was like, this is, because I'm in like endocrinology class and they're like, well, thyroid upregulates the sodium potassium pump. And then I'm like reading this repeat thing where it's like the sodium potassium pump doesn't exist.
Right.
And like the cognitive dissonance, like it was this crazy time in my life where I'm walking around like almost like guilty because everybody's just, going to class and I'm like taking my exams and then I'm like, maybe this isn't real.
It's like you're on psychedelics, right? You just couldn't figure out what was your reality.
What reality was.
I was like obsessed with it because that's what happened with, I don't know about you two and if you've tried a bunch of different diets, but whenever I've gone from one paradigm to the next, you go through kind of like a period of nihilism and then maybe like get really obsessed with learning about the new thing.
Yes.
Probably to an unhealthy extent.
Yeah.
And then you settle in and then it either becomes something that can be sustainable for you or you jump to the next thing. So this was the repeat stuff was like the last, I think, obsession of mine. I've gotten a lot less food obsessed since then, which I take as like a really good thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And then slowly, because coming from a paleo perspective, repeat says things like cholesterol is good. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. So there's these points of contact and he's pro saturated fat. And then the sugar thing, I was just like, this doesn't make any sense. And then I just kept like thinking about it. And I'm in classes where people are presenting research about these things. And it made me ask different questions. And yeah, so during like the 5 years or whatever of my PhD, I became like this, like a repeat disciple. And I happened to work in an estrogen lab, which was sort of by accident because at the end of your first year, you're supposed to pick an advisor. And I had done a couple of lab rotations and just didn't get along with the labs too much. And it was kind of a bummer because I was going to have to pick something I wasn't really interested in. And then there was a seminar and it was this new faculty. It was this really tall guy and he had like a nose piercing. He was like 40, and everybody else is older than that. And he gave this talk about estrogen and I was like, yeah, whatever. But like, this guy looks cool. So I just walked up and I was like, can I do a rotation in your lab? He was in the endocrinology department, but at Rutgers, and I think most universities, they can share graduate students. So there'll be an agreement where like, say, exercise science, nutritional science, endocrinology, and maybe some other departments, you can work in the lab if you're in one department, a student of one department, in another one. And, they can just share all those things. So yeah, I ended up doing a nutrition project in this estrogen lab because he was studying things in the brain that had to do with energy balance. So his main topic was estrogen and energy balance. So I made it fatty acids and energy balance using the same techniques.
Wow.
That's cool.
Well, it's interesting that you said that you went down the lane of all the different diets. That's both of Alice and I have had our day and time through all that. And then I think I asked Danny Roddy the same question, like what makes him stay close to Ray Peat's theories and, his statements. And because I'm wondering if there's going to be a bottom that lets out and there's something that we didn't learn from this one, right? Because, every time you learn a new paradigm, right, you said you get a little nihilist. And, and so this is like where I think a part of like where I'm at is like looking at this stuff, because if you're not in a science-based world where you're constantly learning about all these mechanisms and you're not really, you're just quoting other people. So there's like this part of that need to kind of pay attention and really absorb what you're saying, right? So like when we talk, that's the reason why we bring you guys on, because the history that you guys have, and information that knowledge that you're taking in is helping so many more people by helping get that information out, because all the other stuff that's been like constantly thrown into society is really damaging a lot more people, we think, and so we want to help people.
Yeah, and I have to say that with me, I had to step back from dieting or studying diets for a while. I had to just take a step back. Like, I fell into Ray Peat stuff, and it was very overwhelming at first. I was like, whoa. And but a lot of it was starting to make sense, and then then I was like, okay, I need to take a big break. So I took a big break, and then I came back to it, and I was like, oh, this really it really makes sense. It really works. And when I think about how when I tried all the other stuff, there was always some question about, like, there was always something missing that didn't make a lot of sense, right? And for whatever reason, like I just keep getting. Things keep making sense with a Ray Peat inspired approach, and so that's why I personally keep like wanting to know more, because it seems kind of endless with the the information, because there's just so many circles of truth within his stuff. So that's my take on it. We've definitely been through many different diets for sure, and I know you've probably been through more than I have. Like I did the vegetarian thing for a month, and I couldn't do it. I was like,
I tried the raw vegan stuff. I tried doing I created my own supplementation, because I was in an idea of, well, you learn like how to make things, so you get creative. And then I remember just looking in my truck one day because I was a triathlete, and all I ever did was carry food with me, right? Because, I'm out doing, 60 miles, 100 miles on a bike, or I'm running whatever, 20 miles or whatever. And so my car was my like refrigerator, right? So I would carry all this stuff, but it was all like made from plant-based, because I learned
it's a lot of work to have to do that kind of thing, to do that kind
absolutely was. And it's that's that part you're talking about, the nihilist part of you, that you're just like obsessed to learn, and then like you look back and you're like, what the hell have I been creating?
Right.
It's kind of one of those moments of life, like, whoa, wait, come on, this isn't this complicated. Why are we making it so complicated?
Yeah, it's a psychological thing, because I've always been attracted to extremes. I kind of hate when people say, "Oh, everything in moderation," because it's like, not really. I mean, it's not like, oh, just a little bit of poison.
No.
But at the same time, there is a difference, and this is what I like about Ray Peat, is he doesn't advocate total elimination diets, and I think pretty much everybody else does. Or if you're not doing well on something they say, they'll double down and say, oh, well, you need to cut out, and so although I'm attracted to extremes, I think that attracted me to things like that, where it's like, oh, I feel, like when I was doing the raw vegan thing, especially at first, I didn't know, I was like 19. I didn't know what foods had more calories, like in terms of plant foods. Mm-hmm. So I would just eat like raw vegetables that, I mean, like was like a couple hundred calories, and I thought that was a meal. I was like 135 pounds, which, just for comparison, I'm like 175 now.
Oh, wow.
Way underweight, sounds like.
Yeah. And like I would just, like not, and I'd always be hungry. And all anybody ever says, like online, I got into some forums, is, oh, just wait until like you get rid of all the toxins, and then
just wait, right?
Yeah, it's always it's like the politics of delay, like just
exactly, just hang in there, it'll happen eventually.
Well, I think that's a really a good psychological aspect to maybe talk about, because most people feel like we always have to do something, and like the liver is your main event, right, for everything. But for some reason, everything is like a detox of the liver, detox of this, detox, and it's like we're creating the psychological idea that we're supposed to do something when the body automatically doesn't. If you just stepped out of the way, you'd probably would be in better health than if you just stopped interfering.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I even think the mainstream like, have you read some, like, what Ray writes about, and he quotes people like Gilbert Lang about like theory of the cell and stuff. I even think that the theory of the cell that people use like gets them to feel like, oh, if only I could just, like, they think like I've got all these sacks of liquid and there's like garbage in my sacks, and if I could just like detoxify that, and it'll be like when I was 17 again or something.
Yeah.
That model like mentally helps people have that delusion and sort of strive for something that it's just not real. Like, that's not even what their body is like. It's just a stupid cartoon drawing in these textbooks that isn't really backed up by anything. And people make decisions because when somebody decides that something makes sense, you know, there's always an emotional component to it. So like certain diets, like with vegetarianism, you know, I'm sure like Garden of Eden, like feelings about the world, like make that palatable to people. Like, oh, that makes sense. Like, you shouldn't eat animals and that's bad for you. And
save the planet, make sure you're not destroying the planet for, you know, your obsessiveness or your needs. Yeah, your overconsumptions.
I'm really excited about this show, Kyle, because we did a show a while back, one of our, maybe in the first 10 shows we did, we talked about estrogen, and it's great to have someone on that is studying the estrogen receptors and knows a little bit, can go a little deeper into it, because I think it's super misunderstood by a lot of people, including the medical community. So I'd really like to address that today. That would be great.
Yeah, sure.
And I thought we could maybe then circle back to your lecture and talk a little bit about the last part of the questions that the ladies were asking you, because there is one part where your mic drops, and you know, and I'm like,
I know.
Like, what is he saying?
I remember when that happened.
And she's like, oh, I'll repeat the question, or repeat the answer, and I'm like, yeah, but that wasn't what I wanted to hear what you had to say, because it was a really good question to why people sit there and want to fast and all that, and where insulin resistance comes from, the idea of it, and all that kind of stuff. So if we could kind of bound backwards, that would be awesome.
If a clinical outcome or an experimental outcome of like fixing the problem or certain markers that people have set by, say, cutting sugar out of your diet, like fixing whatever you're measuring, if that's ever happened with another manipulation, like, say, cutting fat out of your diet or fasting or exercising or taking a drug, if you're going to conclude that because removing sugar from a patient's diet corrected something in their blood work or even made them feel better or lose weight, you would have to conclude, and that therefore sugar was causing the problem, you would have to conclude that every time you can demonstrate that thing called, so like, oh, they weren't exercising, that's why exercise, like they had an exercise deficiency. And it gets really ridiculous because, you know, like metformin and the thiazole and edione drugs, they're like insulin sensitizing drugs that some type 2 diabetics get put on.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know of this.
Yeah, just like the more popular ones. Nobody would say, oh, they were insulin resistant because they were deficient in this drug.
Right.
So it's like a one track,
so
like, oh, the sugar was causing it.
So that's the argument they make for when they say sugar causes insulin resistance. That's what you're saying, basically. Yeah.
Well, basically,
like
it's not
taking out sugar fixes it, therefore sugar causes it. But taking out a lot of things fix it.
Right.
Like people can eat a low-fat diet and lose weight and improve insulin sensitivity. So would they then say, "Oh, I guess the fat caused it"? But they'd be like, "No, that's different."
So basically, there's no absolute like variable that will always consistently come through and change every time it doesn't come consistently. It's not always the same thing over and over again.
Well, that's the other point, is that plenty of people eat sugar and it doesn't cause these problems. So unless you can identify like that all of those people have like a specific genetic difference than all the other people, like something really consistent and measurable, then it starts to break down at that point. Because when something, it's kind of a semantic issue, but when something causes something else, like there's no room for like if it's sometimes, then it's not really causing it.
Oh,
It's
right.
like,
Yeah.
related, or like arsenic and cyanide. They it's very consistent, like what like application of those substances.
Yeah.
And
Right.
people know how they work, and there's not just this like, oh, well, some people drop dead and some people can just take unlimited amounts and it's fine. It's like, no, like cyanide causes this thing.
Yeah.
And, some people might need a slightly higher dose to die, but it's pretty consistent.
Absolute. Yeah. Yeah. So it just depending also with the whole, going back to the sugar thing, like someone's metabolism is going to, that's really what is the depending factor, right? On how somebody, reacts to sugar, I guess, in some ways. Too, right?
Yeah, I think that like one of the things, so when you had asked if there's anything that is consistently whatever, like causes or there's not really anything that consistently solves the metabolic syndrome, but you can consistently cause it in people with like endotoxin, like if you just give anybody an injection of endotoxin. So that to me says a lot. And I think sugar, one of the ways it might help is maybe macrophages, like infiltrating the tissues, just produce more cytokines when there's sugar around, because it's such an efficient fuel source for them.
That's a great segue, because I actually liked the slide that you put up about the adipose tissue, or the physiology about the cytokines and the secretion of the adipocyte secreted fatty acids. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about how releasing that fatty acid can, you don't necessarily want to do that. You don't want the insulin to come about, so sugar is going to help that fatty acid from not escaping the cell. Is that correct? Am I on the right track of what you were saying in that slide?
The macrophages, yeah, you don't want to recruit them, and specifically the more fatty acids. When the adipose tissue is in a state of secretion rather than uptake, it induces macrophages to enter a phenotype where they secrete more cytokines. So for whatever reason.
So what I was trying to relate in what you were saying was like, so people do the fasting to lose weight. Somewhere in that discussion, I was trying to figure out what happens when someone tries to lose weight, right? They go into either fasting or they go into ketosis, and they're trying to get rid of their body fat. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of explain what happens with the fatty acids when you're doing fasting? Because people do get accomplishing effects by, restricting their diet, but when they reduce the fat, there's still something going on that's creating an environment that is kind of, in the long run, utilizing too much of the fatty acids? Or am I kind of mixing two different things? If you can kind of see what I'm trying to go at.
So I think one thing that makes it confusing is people will say, oh, I shifted to like a fat burning metabolism.
Right. Yeah.
And people say that in biology for a lot of things, but biology is very rarely like an on and off switch. It's always like in percentages. And there's tissues like the adipose tissue itself, heart, muscle, the myocytes of the cardiac myocytes, and skeletal muscle at rest are always using fatty acids, no matter, even if you're eating a zero fat diet, like you'll be producing some fatty acids, they'll get taken up by those tissues and oxidized along with some sugars just at all times. So when people start to either just not eat food, like fast, or cut out carbohydrates or just sugars and start to eat more fats, they shift the amount of fatty acids that are being used in the more flexible tissues like liver. And then some of the liver is like always the big, 500-pound gorilla, like whatever the liver is doing is the most important.
Right.
But like kidneys and even the pancreas and everything, and the skeletal muscle too. So as you do that, I don't really think that many of the weight loss effects are because you're burning fatty acids because it doesn't really make a difference, like energy wise. If you're consuming a certain amount of fat and you're burning a certain amount of fat versus consuming a certain amount of carbohydrate and just whatever it is, like you'll store whatever the excess is. I think most people just have, like, it does something to satiety. I think if you cut out really any macronutrient, it's really hard to eat a lot. Like if you just don't eat protein or fat or carbohydrate, any one of those, I think that's one of the biggest things, and that causes the weight loss effects. But what the problem is that, and it's not always a problem for everybody that they would see, but if you are losing fat, you're secreting all these fatty acids that you built up over time. That's going to cause a certain amount of damage just by the fatty acids being secreted because of what happens with macrophages, and like the adrenal system gets taxed in that situation. Because that was what the first talk was about from the year before, the 2016 AHS. I talked about why you don't want to be a fat burner.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that on Danny's show. On Generative Energy, the Generative Energy podcast, and you guys were talking about fat metabolism and ketosis and yeah.
Right. So because half of the story is because the fatty acids don't just, it's not like, your body's like, oh, they're eating fat, so now we're gonna, like, there's like, a bunch of things that happen physiologically, and they're not really good. They're not associated with like a healthy physiology. They're like the same thing that happens in starvation is what happens when you cut out carbohydrates. So there's that, and then there's actually the fatty acids getting secreted and used, and those are two different problems.
So one of the things you mentioned was endotoxin, and I remember listening to Ray Peat's interview on KMUD, and he talks about endotoxin and that it's made out of a fatty acid and a sugar, the LPS. So is that the same fatty acid that's in the cells? Is it kind of inducing more of the same attraction of these endotoxins once they come out of this, they leak out of the gut, out of the cell and then leak into the other cells? Is that kind of a cumulative of the fatty acids, or is that a different type of fatty acid?
Well, it's bacterial in origin, so it's not like related to, well, it could be the same. The endotoxin can be made, depending on the bacterial species, out of a few different fatty acids stuck to a few different, sugar moieties.
Yeah.
And there's other molecules too, like lipopeptides and different things bacteria make, but lipopolysaccharide is the most studied one, and it's the most common to see.
Well, the reason why I'm trying to correlate this is to understand like the difference between the oxidative mechanism where you're allowing the cell to create enough energy to produce the carbon dioxide, but the other mechanism where you're creating more fatty acid in lactic acid? I guess it is.
The way I think of it is just like evolutionarily. So instead of trying to think why would it make like. So if we have a system where in absence of carbohydrate or absence of calories, a different system would kick in,
right,
then I just take that as a given, like that's real. Right. And then like back calculate, like, because it's there for a reason. So it's, it's probably not some sort of like mistake. And yeah, if we didn't have these systems, these backup systems, and even the inflammation and cortisol and everything that's involved with them, people would like go into comas if they skipped 2 meals,
Mm-hmm.
Like as soon as your liver was done exporting glucose, that would be it. So, so it's a good thing, that they're there. And then people, that do like a paleo fasting, low carb thing, they kind of are like hacking into these systems to maybe lose weight in a way that's more rapid than they could in another way that might not be healthy long term. But the real problem is when these systems get induced and the person's not fasting, but there's like these molecular problems where their body's like, oh, there's this thing going on, So, we're starving, so we need to like hold on to this fat and, use emergency fuel and emergency hormonal systems. But there is no emergency. There's plenty of food. So the person just keeps fueling that.
Is that like in a situation where someone's malnourished, they're not able to absorb the nutrients they're taking in? Is that would that be that kind of situation? Or
maybe some nutrients. I could see how like a vitamin and mineral deficiencies relative to, absorbing macronutrients could cause, the body to not be able to just partition things correctly. Just briefly, so there's the CO2 thing that, you could talk about that forever, but, burning carbohydrates releases more CO2 than the equivalent amount of fat. And there's some reasons why that might be a good thing. And, but simply I think that for whatever reason of evolution, our body sees a deficit of carbohydrate as like a deficit of food in general. And the presence of carbohydrate is like a go signal for like ramping up the metabolism. So things like thyroid, you could be eating whatever would be calorically sufficient, but people will still usually have reduced thyroid numbers if they cut out carbohydrate. So yeah, that's just, every animal's different, but the human animal, for whatever reason, it was just associated with like in times of plenty when we can afford to have a metabolism that gets ramped up, that's associated with carbohydrate. And there's not really too much around that, that's just how it is.
Yeah. And I think mainly the main reason like Maya and I are interested in that because, I feel like it's very much women go through, the low thyroid, the change in hormonal balance after the age of 40. So that actually I feel like it affects women a little bit more around that time. And so you tend to get women who are trying to lose weight, and they do all the things that are, being talked about with fat burning, or what we call fat burning, and it doesn't work for them. And that's because of what you mentioned. It's the lower thyroid, the lower digestive motility, all those things kind of cascade into that, so that you do end up in somewhat of a deficit of nourishment. So. And that's kind of why I really wanted to talk about estrogen today.
Just before you get started, one of the things that bothers me is that, okay, when the cell is stressed, it's doing a lot of things. And so that's when I'm trying to correlate is how this estrogen is being flowing through the body and causing more problems. So that's what I'm really trying to get into is like, okay, we understand the cell and it's sugar deprived, or it's getting into more endotoxin where it's collecting more calcium. There's a part of this that doesn't make sense to me. And so maybe when you start talking about the estrogen, it may click in. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, all I did, so my lab focused on, like in particular, just like a real quick background on how academia works. So my advisor, he was a new faculty at Rutgers. So he was a pre-tenure faculty. He was an assistant professor, and he had just come from a postdoc. So usually what happens in academia is you do your PhD, and you have an advisor, like I did, and you learn most of your techniques from there. And most people develop most of their ideas of what they want to do and sort of what research concepts that they believe in. And then if there's any shift in that, it's usually if they do a postdoc, they might go somewhere else. Like usually people move to another part of the country and they'll do something related. But I think people like to try to diversify learn some new techniques so they can start applying to assistant professor jobs. But usually what you do in your postdoc, you take to an assistant professor job and sort of expand on that. So you become like part of the lineage of your postdoctoral advisor. The head of the lab, the primary investigator of the lab that you did your postdoc in. So my advisor did his postdoc at Oregon, I think, State University. So they studied something called rapid estrogen signaling.
Okay.
Which was this new thing 40 years ago. Which was the classical, all steroids, the classical model of how they affect your cells, the cells that are sensitive to them, which are really all cells, but is that there's a receptor, right? And then there's the steroid, and it binds together. And then this binding event could happen anywhere in the cell. But upon binding, if it's not already in the nucleus, it travels to the nucleus, like some kind of signal of binding sends it to the nucleus, so estrogen and estrogen receptor. And then it will dock on a part of the nucleus that has, in the case of estrogen, what's called an estrogen response element, which is a sequence of a genetic sequence that recognizes the bound estrogen receptor. And then the idea is the bound estrogen receptor docks onto that, and whenever something binds to the DNA, it changes its shape a little bit. And the general theory is that the shape can be changed to either make binding of RNA polymerase to express those genes more accessible or less accessible. So things can be upregulated or downregulated by making the sort of, I guess a lot of these are like cartoon representations, but unwinding it to allow the big, because the polymerase enzymes are very large. So they have to be able to make contact with the gene to transcribe it. And so that's the classical theory of how estrogen and all other steroids work, is that there's certain genes that have estrogen response elements near their sequences. And by binding with the estrogen receptor that only binds when it is itself bound to estrogen that makes it active, it makes those genes that would be upregulated by the presence of estrogen transcribed more than they were before because of that binding. And then in the 70s, it was discovered that some of the effects, like some of the effects of estrogen on cells, were happening at a speed that was too fast for that to be the reason for the estrogen receptor complex to translocate to the nucleus and cause a gene transcription change. That takes a pretty long time, like 30 minutes usually, to see a noticeable change in the amount of protein, because first the RNA gets made and then it has to be translated into the protein. And by the time you have an amount of protein that you can measure in the lab or that would affect the cell's physiology, many, many minutes have gone by. And these were rapid effects that would be seen in like 5 minutes. So it was posited that there was a membrane receptor. I hope this doesn't sound boring. It's so convoluted.
No, I just keep going in the back of my head going, well, Ray says there's no such thing as receptors. So.
Right. Yeah. And there's no membrane either.
I know where you're going with this.
Right. So this is just the mainstream explanation of, when observations happen that don't fit their previous model, unfortunately what happens is that, the incentive is to create like another detail that would explain that rather than go backwards and like reassess the previous stuff. So it sort of builds up. So
that's how it happens. Okay.
Right. because your people's careers are bound with the ligand of their previous data. And they can't upregulate their income if that receptor complex doesn't happen.
That's great.
If you look at the publications like rapid estrogen signaling, there's people that say there's a separate receptor that can receive the signal of these steroids at the cell surface. And then there's another theory, which is the one that my advisor was working on, which is that estrogen receptor itself, when it binds with estrogen, even just in the cytoplasm, can have effects on the sort of usual suspect downstream effect molecules like cyclic AMP and like that whole. Whenever you look at a receptor, it usually goes through like an alphabet soup of 3 to 10 enzymes and then eventually does something. So that was the theory. And the main way he studied it, so you can study estrogen receptor pretty easily by making a transgenic mouse that just doesn't have it. So that would be a estrogen receptor knockout. And then compare that to the wild type. And then somebody developed this thing called the knock-in knockout. So a knock-in is when you add something and a knockout is taking it away. So this was adding a messed up estrogen receptor, that everything was the same, but that DNA binding domain that connects to the estrogen response element was messed up, so it couldn't do it. But these animals, they had a phenotype that was in between for some of the metrics of the wild type that has a fully functioning estrogen system and the estrogen receptor knockouts. And that was the main field of study that was going on in my lab. And it's kind of how I learned about estrogen receptor. And I had my advisor explain this to me like so many times. And it's one of those things, like, can you tell when people don't really know like what
they're talking about?
Yeah, or like they do, but it's not like when people are explaining things and it doesn't make sense, but they don't know that, or I don't want to say that it doesn't make sense.
Kind of what they've learned, and they've kind of memorized that story in a way. Is that what you're saying? Okay, yeah. Yeah,
so I was really intellectually curious, so I was always, asking these questions and stuff, and that gets discouraged pretty quickly.
Yes, right?
And that's probably what like funneled me into the repeat theories, because I was like, well, I can't get anything over here, so I'm over here. Right. Nobody wants to like ask the hard questions or anything. Like if there's just one observation, the way I think of it is if there's one observation that doesn't fit with your theory, that's it. Like your theory's done. Yeah. But that's just not the way that people do it. They're like, they just ignore that one. They're like, well, we've got 5 that fit.
Yeah.
So 5 is a bigger
That's
number. That's
mind-boggling. Yeah.
Right. Or it's just, and then people start to compartmentalize.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which people talk about like, oh, scientists are so specialized. And I think it's a defense mechanism, because it's kind of like almost like somebody in the military, like, well, I just follow orders, so I'm not responsible for killing somebody. And then the general's like, well, I just do, everybody's got like a specialized job, and nobody's responsible. Nobody goes like, if this is wrong, I'm wrong. Nobody ever wants to do that. So they're always like, oh, well, that's not really it's like, oh, the deep theory of estrogen receptor, or, somebody who say crystallized the protein to get like the structure, that person is the person to ask about X. Mm-hmm. And then some other person who did like this experiment that showed this. And then, because when you get to these things where, say, the theory doesn't make sense, people just defer these other people. And so you can't get everybody in a room, like 12 people that would be an expert on each thing, and then be like, okay, does this make sense? Because it's just not practical to ever do that.
Or truthful. Right?
Right.
Because why would anybody want to know the real truth of what's going on? Because someone's going to end up having to pay the price of being wrong.
Well, somebody.
Like you said. So
and somebody has to say they're wrong. And then, especially if you're making money off of a product that you developed because the science backs it up. Like I heard one time Ray Pete, I was listening to one of his radio or one of the shows he did, and he said, well, you can patent estrogen, but you can't patent progesterone.
Yes. Yeah.
So
I remember when I heard that.
Wow, that's so crazy.
Yeah, that was when I decided to write the book that I'm trying to write. That when I heard him say that, because I was trying to figure out, after I pretty much accepted like that I agreed with Ray Pete, I was like, but why the hell are doctors always pushing estrogen? Like, and why is the research community always pushing estrogen? Like in these departments, like whatever biomedical, whatever department of whatever university, it's not even 9 out of 10. It's like 49 out of 50 mentions of like female this, female that. It's always estrogen, always estrogen. And I would just like as a joke be like, haha, what about progesterone? And it's like people go, oh yeah, it's just completely ignored. And it's like, shouldn't they be sort of like equally considered, at least? It's just equally considered.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And then when I finally heard him say that, I was like, it just made everything make sense. And I started to understand that what's taught in the universities is just back titrated from the pharmaceutical system, and then they control like the American Medical Association, which controls what's taught at the medical schools, which has to be the same as what's taught in like to PhD programs. So it's this whole thing where, and nobody knows about it because everybody's compartmentalized. So they're like, yeah, everybody just agrees that estrogen is the most important thing for females. And everybody agrees.
Even, you know, despite the fact that many females have major issues from taking it, you know, I just don't even, it blows my mind. And there's studies out there as well that tell you, you know, the negative effects of estrogen over time. So, you know, at this point, there's no excuse for really giving people estrogen, I think. That's my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, I gave one of the classes, actually I had like 3 classes. They're my favorite classes in graduate school. They were seminar classes where the students would practice giving talks, like as if they were at a conference or something. Kind of like the talk that I gave at AHS, but more formal. And you'd pick a topic that's not exactly what your dissertation is going to be, so that it's not just, you know, practice for doing that, but something that you kind of like are interested in on the side. And one of the ones I did was estrogen not preventing osteoporosis or no, what was this? Or heart disease. One of the things that estrogen supposedly, like the reason why women have less heart attacks than men is
I think
estrogen.
It's heart disease. Yeah.
And I went through and showed all these studies about like giving postmenopausal women estrogen and how it didn't seem to help. And every one of the big clinical trials was ended before its planned end date because the amount, they have like a cutoff point for if the amount of breast cancer or uterine cancer is higher than the placebo, a certain amount higher, they have to stop the study.
Oh, wow.
You're killing too many people with your product.
Too many people. Yeah. Jeez.
Yeah. We got to pull the plug. We'll try it again next year.
Stop now.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the estrogen and help me geek out a little bit. We talk about it like as the pregnenolone, right? And it's the grandmother of everything in terms of where progesterone and estrogen come from. Can you talk about a little bit of the estrogen reception and what happens when it's released and it's created and where it goes? Because one of the things we try to tell people is how to eat a carrot to help reduce the endotoxins, to help release the estrogen and stuff like that, and maybe correlate that in there if you can.
Oh, that's a pretty
that's a loaded question.
So okay, well, all right. I'll try and find a part somewhere I can start on that. One of the things another thing that Ray Pete said that I found interesting that got me thinking differently is that because one of the observations that maintains like a sort of estrogen story is the estrogen in the blood, and a lot of times, you know, like postmenopausal women will have low serum estrogen, and so if they're having some kind of problem, like their bones are losing density or whatever, it makes sense. Like, oh, they don't have enough estrogen because they're not, you know, going through a normal estrus cycle. And it ends up that progesterone, you know, kicks estrogen out of the cell. So it opposes the estrogen receptor. So those women might have like a bunch of estrogen in their cells, doing a lot of stuff. And then you just give them more, and that's not a good idea. And I talked about that like with my advisor, and he was kind of like, he was like going to contradict it. And then he was like, well, yeah, but, so the way I like to think of it is backing up all the way to like biologically, evolutionarily, why do we have this thing? And so, you know, in the human, you know, you have the two sexes, and unfortunately, to be able to be fertile and just go through the whole cycle, you need a proliferative signal in the uterus, and for certain things to happen that are essentially stressful and quasi-cancerous, like almost like a controlled bout of proliferative, like a benign malignancy that would happen very temporarily, so that an egg can be able to be available for fertilization and then survive after that, and all of that stuff. Okay, so it's no surprise that if you have that requirement, then the body will evolve a way to fulfill that requirement, and it's the estrogen system. And once you have a system and you have a molecule, then as evolution continues, other systems will use that molecule. So like breast tissue growth. You could probably genetically engineer an animal that would have breast tissue growth from a different molecule. But since female fertility and sexual maturity is already linked to the estrogen and progesterone system, why not just have those things be the same thing, right? Like all of these things are kind of pushing in one direction towards creating a sexually mature female human. Mm-hmm. And then progesterone is, to my way of thinking, the thing that's there so that estrogen doesn't do what it would normally do if it was completely unopposed, which is just cause uterine proliferation to continue, or, and in the breast tissue and everywhere else, and cause, breast cancer, cervical cancer, uterine cancer, cancers in other tissues too, but those first. And it does this by kicking the estrogen out of these tissues so that it can be metabolized by the liver, basically tagged as we can excrete this.
Right.
And so the problems come about when the estrogen hangs out for longer than it's supposed to, either because there's not enough progesterone, or if the liver is like sluggish, to use like a non-technical term. Yeah. And then, stuff like the reabsorption of estrogen in the bile, and that's what you were saying with Repeat and the carrot idea, is that, the bile has all of these things that are like lipid molecules that help solubilize intestinal lipids to absorb. And you can get rid of some of those that get sort of just thrown in there with, even like charcoal or whatever, things that just sort of
absorb it.
Adhere to it and like sequester it away from reabsorption by enterocytes. So, and was that like did that make sense?
That made sense. Because that was an interesting way to put it too. Like estrogen being kind of like a temporary cancer. I've never heard anybody describe it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little hyperbolic, but just it's. Its job is literally it causes proliferation of cells,
right?
And sort of like a stress, like an activated cell, like the cells take up more calcium. Basically, everything that happens in cancer, and indeed, everybody knows, even the pro-estrogen researchers and doctors, they know that, a certain amount of estrogen will cause cancer.
Yeah.
Like it's just an inevitable thing that, like, if you give a woman estrogen with no progesterone at a certain dose, her likelihood of getting like breast cancer or uterine cancer or whatever is like, phenomenally high. Yeah. So it's just a matter of, and they would say, oh, well, like we just need to have enough to have the beneficial effects and not so much that causes cancer. But what they don't realize is there are no beneficial effects.
Yeah, that's what I'm finding out.
Estrogen and endotoxin and some other things, they seem to affect the way the cell interacts with water. Mm-hmm. So,
because it fills the cell up with water as it holds the calcium and causes the increase of nitric acid, right?
Right, bulk water. Okay. So generally, and that's where the mainstream cell model breaks down, because to them, the cell is mostly bulk water, and then there's like a little drawn mitochondria here and whatever Golgi apparatus or whatever, like the different organelles are supposed to be. But if you just do I don't have the calculations in front of me, but the amount of protein in a cell and then like the volume of the cell and just look at the density, it's so dense that in between the different proteins, on average, there might be like 3 water molecules,
Okay.
you know, and at that level of density of material, you don't have water as we think of it. So one thing that I always ask people is, have you ever had 2 microscope slides, like glass microscope slides, and put them together when they're wet
Right.
Yep.
versus when they're dry? You can't pull them apart.
Right, because adhesion.
You have to shear them apart like this. You can't pull them apart. And how the hell is that water? And this is like the Gilbert-Ling hypothesis, but Pollack started with that too, is that, you know, the cell is this big bunch of protein that is a little bit more negatively charged than positively charged. So it has this net negative charge, and it pulls in positively charged ions, and mostly potassium, because potassium's hydrated radius is smaller, so it gets in these nooks and crannies, and then water always comes with it. But at the amount of protein and the small amount of water relative to that and the ions, it's not really like a liquid. It's like a more like Jello, you know. I mean, everybody knows that all Jello is just, I mean, you put sugar in there too, but you can make the same thing with just the gelatin
And water.
and
Yeah,
water.
that makes sense. That makes sense.
And so if you just show somebody that, it's like, is that water? You know, and the amount of protein in gelatin, like to get that colloid, that level of firmness, is not even the same density as in the cell. So if you think of like how jiggly and how soft Jello is, that's much more closer to bulk water than your cells are.
Right.
Which is pretty obviously true, because if you just look at yourself, like, you're more solid than Jello. One hopes.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, it makes sense in a way that talks about the leakiness, like, of the cell when it starts to basically break apart, and that's the cell proliferation part. And so if estrogen does the same thing, causes more increase of water to come in and change, I guess, the ratio of the density, you know, of that bulk water, then you're basically doing the same thing. You're flooding the cell into the point where it's just going to literally just fall apart. And so if endotoxins does the same thing, and then estrogen does the same thing, that makes more sense of why cancer is that same kind of mechanism, right? Because it's the cell constantly breaking down, and getting caught up in a certain loop, right? Because the system doesn't run like it needs to, right?
Yeah, probably the biggest signal for a cell to split into 2 daughter cells is the amount of bulk water in the cell. So when you measure cells, you know, growing on a petri dish, you can tell their generation times, and you can measure. Well, actually, the MRI machine that detects cancer, what it's really detecting is how much bulk water is in the cells.
Oh.
Which is really funny, because that's a big Gilbert-Ling thing. The guy who invented it was, I forget his first name, Richard maybe, Demadian, and somebody else got credit. But
Always.
the idea is that you excite an ion, like a potassium ion, inside of the cell and outside of the cell. So if you're sending this energy in, and it's going to excite these ions at a certain wavelength of energy, and then as you take it away, they'll de-excite and fall back down to their normal spin and energy level, and that you can measure that in this scanner, how long that takes to happen. So if there is more bulk water, then an excited ion will take longer to fall back down because it has more space to move around. Whereas if it's in this complex with proteins and this tight colloid, it will come back to its unexcited state faster. So the difference in those 2 times, that's how you can basically detect cancer, is these excited ions, their relaxation time is longer. Time to relax. So that indicates that there's cancer in that area because there's bulk water there.
If you think about like a slow thyroid too, and a slow metabolism, and those are all kind of the characteristics of someone, just the overall energy of someone that is going through something like that, right? That reminds me of the test that you can do for thyroid on someone's
reflex
ankle. Yeah, the reflex thing. Yeah. That would be, I guess, a good low tech test too for that, in a way. I mean,
that's kind of related.
Yeah.
Because the thing about like muscle and tendons and basically all cells, but people think that the like contraction is where you're spending energy, but really it's the relaxation and the ability to contract again. Because like if you've ever picked up a dead animal or something, and they've been dead long enough to have gone through rigor mortis. Their muscles are tight and contracted.
Oh, yeah.
So it doesn't, there's no energy in there.
Right. The energy allows them to relax and then have this potential to contract. And it's kind of like that at the entire cell level. Like the cell needs energy to be in the relaxed state. And it's like a potential. And then that energy falls down and gets used to be activated. And then it takes energy to move it back up. So it's like kind of like a waterfall.
Oh, this is
so maybe to some extent, could that have something to do with people that are like hyper?
So I'm having like a mind-blowing moment because
I knew what you were thinking.
I have some studies on the neurology and how the nervous system responds, and one of the teachers that I learned from said, if you can't contract well, you can't relax well. So like if you try to stimulate the cell to totally contract and let it to its fullest contraction and then release it and then do a small pulse afterwards, the body will start to release itself even more. And I demonstrated that with a client just yesterday, and I thought, okay, I'll try this. And they said to do it with the muscle that isn't the tightest so they could get the feeling of it. And sure enough, he was like, oh my God, like the whole body just relaxed. And you could see his like whole shoulders just dropped. And it was like, this makes more sense why you're giving us the science behind it. So I'm so excited for knowing that part.
Yeah, I think that I know that exercise. I think that it has to do with like people get like a improper ratio of like the excitatory neuropeptides and the basically like GABA and glutamate or and if you sort of like really like contract really hard and then let go, it has like a temporary like hyper relaxive effect, and people didn't realize before that they were slightly contracted.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So Kyle, can you tell everybody where we can find you? Because I know I mentioned your blog in the beginning, nutricanology.com, and sometimes you're on the repeatforum.com. Is there anywhere else people can find you or anything that you're promoting at the moment? I'm
actually like trying to start a podcast with somebody that I met at one of the Ancestral Health Symposium things.
Oh, cool.
And we've recorded like 7 or 8 episodes, but didn't actually go through the process of like making a feed yet. But it's going to be called Nutrition Deconstructed.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, I like that.
And it's going to be like, I guess, the philosophy of science around mainly based around nutrition.
Awesome. Well, when are you launching that? Do you know? Or
good question. Well, right now that like Nutrition Deconstructed podcast.com is a website that has like the first episode on the website.
Oh, great. Who are you doing it with? Do I know this person?
His name's Steve Businger, and I don't know, like when you talked to me in Portland, or is that where we were? Portland?
Seattle.
Yeah. Sorry.
You were the right continent, at least. The right side of it.
The Pacific Northwest. Yeah.
Me and him were hanging out a lot, so you probably saw like me talking to him if you like saw me hanging out. But we met at the previous one, and he was like, he came up to me and he was like, oh, like you must like Ray Pete, because like he got the whole because I was talking about CO2 and stuff like that.
Right.
So
yeah. We'll have to have you on again to talk about CO2.
Yeah. And I'm not really promoting anything. I have all these ideas, but it's taken me forever to do them.
We commend you for putting yourself out there and learning all about the science world, because when Ray told us about his dilemma of like going into like certain fields and trying to find studies that he liked without all the dogma, it sounds like it's still there, and that's kind of a hurdle to kind of have to go through just to get some information, right? Just to enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I think it's probably worse now. I wouldn't recommend that people do it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it's just
man.
So when people ask me, I say there's two reasons that you should do a science PhD. One is if you just like your life's dream is to be a professor, and like you don't care if you have to, do things that you don't want to do, or just jump through hurdles and stuff like that. And the other reason is if you're trying to do some sort of like what's it called when you infiltrate like like a clandestine infiltrative like destruction of the system or something,
right?
Where like you're really driven passionately to get the system's credentials to use against them. And so it's kind of like two polar opposite reasons. And if you're anywhere in between, like if you don't have a passion for one or the other, then because like the money, like for the amount of work it is, and like you just kind of considered like sort of slave labor, and you don't really get to be too creative unless you get into a good situation with a good advisor, or you're a very forceful personality. People get pushed around a lot, and I don't think it's worth it unless you have like a reason. Like you should have the goal at the end and be like, I have to do this to get there. You shouldn't just do it and then be like, well, I'll find a job when I'm done with this process. It's not that. It's too like abusive of a process.
Well, we really appreciate you being on the show, and definitely would love to have you back on to tell us more. And CO2 or whatever. Whatever you got.
Thanks. It was fun.
Maybe we can do CO2 next time. Yeah. Well, thanks, Kyle. We appreciate it. But good luck on your podcast, and keep us in the loop with that for sure. So.
Yeah, totally. I'll let you know whenever I do anything.
Awesome.
Okay. Cool. All right. We'll talk to you soon. All right. Bye, Kyle.
Bye.